Friedrich Engels and the Foundations of Socialist Governance by ROLAND BOER. Chapter 3, Socialist, Gewalt, and the Dictatorship of the Proletariat. Abstract. This chapter deals with proletarian Gewalt, which Engels sees as necessary in both the revolutionary process and in the early stages of socialist construction. The concrete manifestation of this socialist Gewalt is the dictatorship of the proletariat, which Engels, like Marx, defines carefully not as an individual dictatorship as with Bakunin, or by a small band, Blanquist, but as a collective dictatorship by the majority, the workers. Engels' important contribution was to go beyond Marx and identify the Paris Commune with the proletarian dictatorship. The context was a struggle with the moderates of the large German Social Democratic Party, who tried to dispense with the dictatorship of the proletariat and work within bourgeois democracy. In light of later tendencies in European communism to downplay the proletarian dictatorship and idealize the Paris Commune, Eurocommunism, and some Western Marxists, Engels' explicit argument that the Commune was the exercise of the proletarian dictatorship, even that it did not go far enough in exercising such a dictatorship, is a timely warning. The chapter concludes by analyzing Engels' explicit usage of socialist Gewalt itself, both before and after a revolution, emphasizing that political power also has economic influence and potency. Potens. Keywords: socialist Gewalt, dictatorship of the proletariat, Paris Commune, struggle with moderates, economic potence. Opening remarks. The previous chapter left us with the question as to whether Engels also wrote of socialist Gewalt. He did so in two main respects: the dictatorship of the proletariat and Gewalt itself. The core question for Engels was what would happen to existing forms of the state after a proletarian revolution. Footnote. That a communist revolution itself would entail violence is obvious to Engels. Generated objectively out of the contradictions of capitalism between increasingly socialized production and capitalist appropriation, such a revolution would entail a violent explosion. See also his reference to the Bakunists who had seized Alcoy in Spain by violence and were thus in open conflict with the government. End of footnote. On this matter, Engels inherited a tension from Marx between the commune and the dictatorship of the proletariat. Marx did not have the energy or longevity to be able to solve the tension. He may have acknowledged it and even attempted the beginnings of a narrative progression from dictatorship to commune, but he offered no real solution. By contrast, Engels did live longer and certainly had more energy later in life. The result, he realized ever more clearly that the proletarian dictatorship entailed the use of authority, power, force, and even violence. In short, it was to be the exercise of socialist Gewalt. One had to deal decisively with the extremely powerful forces of reaction and counter-revolution. As Mao Zedong observed, a revolution is no dinner party. At the same time, Engels moved beyond Marx on one crucial item. He increasingly asserted that the proletarian dictatorship and the commune are one and the same. He may have entertained for a time a narrative progression from one to the other, but his main point is their actual conflation. Political circumstances played a role, particularly in the German Social Democratic Party. Its stunning growth and influence had led to recognition and elected representatives in the Reichstag. But this very circumstance also fostered a right wing that became decidedly nervous about any talk of a proletarian dictatorship. An idealized commune was fine, but the proletarian dictatorship had to be excised from its program. Engels responded in the early 1890s by arguing ever more strongly for the importance of the proletarian dictatorship, which was no longer separate from the commune but part of its very structure and actions. Political developments were not the only factor, for theoretical clarification was also important. As Engels returned to study, edit, and write introductions to a number of Marx's key texts, The Civil War in France and the Class Struggles in France, 1848 to 1850, edited for the first time in book form, and Critique of the Gotha Program, he came to understand that the commune was not an idealized form of human goodwill, but a tough reality that during its brief existence had already begun to enact the measures of the proletarian dictatorship. The bulk of this chapter deals with these developments, giving detailed attention to key 5 texts from Engels. The first text is The Housing Question, 1872 to 1873, where Engels broaches the connection between the commune and the proletarian dictatorship, while the second and third texts, the Introduction to Marx's The Civil War in France and the Critique of the Erfurt Program, both from 1891, make the connection far more explicit. The fourth text was the 1895 introduction to the newly edited book, Marx's The Class Struggle in France, 1848 to 1850, where Engels struggled mightily against the right-wing tendency in the German Social Democratic Party. The final text is a little earlier. From an 1890 letter to Conrad Schmidt, the text connects political power, Macht, economic force, potens, and Gewalt itself. These significant connections open up the treatment of socialist Gewalt in the final part of the chapter. Or rather, it deals with direct references to socialist Gewalt and authority, which make clear that the whole treatment of proletarian dictatorship is actually an elaboration of what such Gewalt means. Defining dictatorship. Engels deployed the terminology of proletarian dictatorship during 2 periods. One, between 1872 and 1874, in the aftermath of the Paris Commune, and the other between 1890 and 1891, as the Communists became a distinct political force, especially in the German Social Democratic Party, with the resultant debates over theory and strategy. Each usage defines the term further, before Engels fixes more clearly on what it means for socialism in power. Let us follow this process of clarification, from which 2 items become more important. To begin with, Engels distinguishes between individual and collective dictatorship. The former appears frequently in his texts, whether Bismarck, Gladstone, Palmerston, Louis Napoleon, and other state leaders or opponents within the wider revolutionary movement. The latter often suffer from Diktaturgelust and Diktatur zu spielen, with Bakunin especially, as the conflict with the anarchists heated up in the 1870s, described as an individual dictator. The Blanquists, too, tend towards a dictatorship of one or several individuals. Footnote. For a detailed refutation of the myth that dictatorship of the proletariat has Blanquist origins, see Draper, 1986. End of footnote. In response, Engels stresses that after a communist revolution, a dictatorship should be a collective one of the entire revolutionary class, the proletariat. Whatever the vagaries of socialism in actual power after Engels' time, the theoretical point is clear. Further, as he points out to the Proudhonists, another distinct current in the Paris Commune, the proletarian dictatorship is by no means exceptional or outside the mainstream. Every real proletarian party, he writes in The Housing Question, has a class policy according to which an independent political party is the primary condition of struggle, and the dictatorship of the proletariat is the immediate aim of the struggle. More important is a clear step beyond Marx, the conflation of the Paris Commune with the dictatorship of the proletariat. As noted earlier, Marx was somewhat reluctant to make the connection, so much so that it became a contradiction that he sought to resolve. While the Commune primarily concerns the relations of production with decentralization, overcoming repression, and a free association of workers, the proletarian dictatorship deals with the means of production, is centralized and repressive, so as to crush the bourgeois dictatorship and the counter-revolution. Marx's scattered efforts at a resolution of the contradiction began to shape a narrative that moves from dictatorship to commune, but it was a tentative beginning. Why does Engels make the move to connect the commune and proletarian dictatorship? And what are the implications for understanding socialism in power? The answer to the first question requires detailed analysis of the key texts, but the second question may be answered briefly here, before returning to it later. In contrast to tendencies to focus on the Paris Commune and to downplay the dictatorship of the proletariat, Engels reminds us both that the dictatorship of the proletariat is central to any form of socialist governance, especially in its early stages, and that the Commune itself was not a quasi-utopian moment, but entailed measures that already began to destroy the old order. In order to determine why and how Engels makes the connection, an examination of three key texts is needed. Let me quote them first. Quote, "It does the commune the greatest honor that in all its economic measures the driving spirit was in accordance with the spirit of German scientific socialism. In the same way, when the so-called Blankists made an attempt to transform themselves from mere political revolutionists into a socialist workers' faction with a definite program, they adopted, and almost literally at that, the views of German scientific socialism on the necessity of political action by the proletariat and of its dictatorship as the transition to the abolition of classes, and with them of the state, views such as had already been expressed in the Communist Manifesto, and since then on innumerable occasions. Of late, the German Philistine," footnote, the original manuscript had Social Democratic Philistine, which the editors replaced with German Philistine, end of footnote, has once more been filled with wholesome terror at the words dictatorship of the proletariat. Well and good, gentlemen. Do you want to know what this dictatorship looks like? Look at the Paris Commune. That was the dictatorship of the proletariat. First, if one thing is certain, it is that our party and the working class can only come to power under the form of a democratic republic. This is even the specific form for the dictatorship of the proletariat, as the great French Revolution has already shown." End quote. In the first text, the housing question from 1872 to 1873, the conflation is oblique, while in the second it is clearest. Each text has its own particular context and points, to which I now turn. The housing question, 1872 to 1873. The immediate context for the quotation from the housing question is an argument with a certain Adolf Mühlberger's defense of Proudhonism in reply to earlier criticisms by Engels. Footnote, Mühlberger's articles originally appeared in a series in Der Volksstaat. Engels also engages with Mühlberger's Die Wohnungsfrage, einen Sozialskizze, separate Abdruck aus dem Volksstaat, Leipzig, 1872, end of footnote. It is not necessary to follow the twists and turns of this long criticism, for the relevant point is that when it came to actual revolutionary action, and particularly the exercise of power and the first steps in trying to construct socialism, workers adopted the practical measures of German scientific socialism, that is, the proposals put forward by Engels and Marx. The only example available was the Paris Commune, to which Engels turns to back up his point. Thus, the Proudhonist economic measures, footnote, the following examples are given: abolition of night work in the bakeries, prohibition of monetary fines in the factories, confiscation of shut down factories and workshops, and handing them over to the workers' associations, end of footnote, soon revealed that practice took on the path of scientific socialism. So also with political measures for which the Blankists in the Commune were responsible. Footnote, Engels refers to a text, Internationale et Revolution, published in 1872 by Blankist fugitives from the Commune in London, in which they put forward their position in light of experiences in the Commune. End of footnote. They, too, Engels is keen to point out, went against their principles of minority dictatorship by a small hard core of revolutionaries, and also adopted the communist program, including the necessity of political action by the proletariat and of its dictatorship. While the connection between the commune and the proletarian dictatorship is somewhat oblique, the connection has indeed been made. Footnote, it may also be suggested that Engels appropriated earlier criticisms of the commune as a collective dictatorship. See Draper, 1986, for an outline of the development of this anti-communist criticism. End of footnote. Two other relevant issues arise from the text. To begin with, we find a clear narrative of how power might work after a revolution. The proletarian dictatorship functions as the transition to the abolition of classes, and with them of the state. Note the narrative: proletarian dictatorship, transition, abolition of classes, and the abolition of the state. Later, it would become the dying away of the state, in distinction from the anarchists, but all of this requires political action by the proletarian dictatorship after it has seized power through a revolution. With his typical clarity, Engels here specifies what Marx began to explore in his later writings from 1871, but never made explicit. Footnote, For a detailed analysis of all the relevant texts, see BOER 2019. End of footnote. Further, Engels adds an intriguing comment to the sentence I have been discussing. He writes that what may be called the post-revolutionary narrative had already been expressed in the Communist Manifesto, and since then on innumerable occasions. This is a curious point, for the Communist Manifesto of 1848 does not use dictatorship of the proletariat, let alone any direct observation concerning the state. Instead, it includes centralization and repression, which become part of a course of development in which class distinctions and antagonisms disappear, and public power loses its political character to be replaced with an association characterized by the free development of each as the condition for the free development of all. The closest the Communist Manifesto comes to a proletarian dictatorship is the usage of despotic inroads. In light of the later clarity and sharpening of terminology by Engels, especially in the aftermath of the Paris Commune, the Communist Manifesto's proposal appears somewhat embryonic and idealistic. What are we to make of the claim by Engels, and indeed by Marx 2 decades earlier, that the Communist Manifesto already contained the idea of the proletariat dictatorship, as well as its transitional role in the eventual dissolution of classes and the state? We may read this claim in two ways. Strictly speaking, there is no literal mention of the dictatorship of the proletariat in the Communist Manifesto. The term itself appears only later in the works of both Engels and Marx. At the same time, most of the components of such a dictatorship are present: repression of the old ruling class, despotic inroads into bourgeois production, and centralization of working-class Gewalt. At the time, the description still needed a name, which was soon to come. Introduction to the third edition of Marx's The Civil War in France, 1891. If the conflation between commune and proletarian dictatorship was oblique in 1872 to 1873, it was perfectly clear almost 2 decades later. In his introduction to the third edition of Marx's The Civil War in France, Engels writes, "Do you want to know what this dictatorship looks like? Look at the Paris Commune. That was the dictatorship of the proletariat. The Commune is the proletarian dictatorship. Notably, Marx's text in this case does not mention the proletarian dictatorship, so it is Engels who makes the connection." Footnote. It appears in another text republished a little later as The Class Struggles in France, 1848 to 1850. See below. End of footnote. However, the sentences I have quoted come at the conclusion of the introduction with the phrase "dictator des proletariats" being the arresting and challenging last words. Footnote. The challenge was mainly directed at the Social Democratic Philistine, about whom I will have more to say in a moment. Notably, the text was changed by the editors of Die Neue Zeit, and in the subsequent publication of Marx's text in book form, to German Philistine. This alteration, most likely with Engels's grudging consent, may have had as much to do with presenting a united front to external critics as it did with softening the force of Engels's text. End of footnote. The lead-up to the conclusion is an extremely intriguing text, of which 2 features are important for the present analysis. The first concerns the effort to strengthen the measures undertaken by the Paris Commune so as to bring it much closer to the proletarian dictatorship. The second identifies a significant linguistic struggle, as Engels attempts to describe structures that resemble a state in so many respects, but which is at the same time not a state as he had defined it. In terms of proletarian muscle, let me begin with the following. The decrees of the Commune were in the direct interest of the working class, and in part cut deep into the old order of society. Engels is keen to emphasize that this attack on the old order took place precisely when elected workers were in control, and the Commune's class character became apparent. But what measures? They are the ones that thoroughly challenge the separation between state and society, so that the commune's forms of governance began to become enmeshed within society. These include replacing the standing army with a militia from the whole population, a position dear to Engels given his long-standing insights into military matters, limited differences in pay, factories to be reopened and run by worker cooperatives, closing of employment offices run by police appointees, and the institution of radical democratic practices. Let me say a little more on the last point. Engels emphasizes two features of the commune's structures of governance: universal suffrage for all administrative, judicial, educational posts, with the right to recall and to pay for officials that was no more than pay for common workers. Engels points out that such measures were effective barriers against place hunting and careerism, as well as ensuring continuous accountability through the right to recall at any time. Lest we be tempted to see here a celebration of a socialist form of liberal bourgeois democracy, or perhaps social democracy itself, we should note the following. Engels speaks of universal suffrage for those concerned, indeed, that the right of recall was exercised by these same concerned ones. Footnote. Translation mine. End of footnote. Betelgeuse, in our time spelled Betelgeuse, is crucial here, for it designates a person who is involved, who is a participant. And which participants does Engels mean? The workers of the commune. They are entitled to vote, and not the exploiters of the former ruling class, or indeed any enemies of the commune. This is universal suffrage within the new structure. Here lie the seeds of what would later become, in rather different contexts, socialist democracy, in which the vast majority, workers and peasants, exercise rule. All of these measures had the effect of beginning the process of overcoming the separation of state and society, characteristic of the old bourgeois order. Even the Proudhonists and Blanquists, whom we already met in the housing question, with their respective positions concerning economic measures and political structures, began to fall into line. Thus, the Proudhonists soon realized the need for large cooperatives in factories rather than small peasant and craft independence, and the Blanquists gave up their conspiratorial politics centered around a small and highly disciplined band, dictatorship of the few, and instituted measures that can only be described as the dictatorship of the proletariat. Thus far, we have focused on internal measures enacted by the commune, but Engels also offers an external comparison to show what precisely was being destroyed. His preferred example is the United States, since it was regarded at the time as the most advanced form of the bourgeois state, although even this state was meant to be the servant of society, an instrument in the service of the people. It had instead become dominated by two cartels, two great gangs of political speculators that alternatively take possession of state power and exploit it by corrupt means and for corrupt ends. Engels suggests that the people of the United States had not initially intended this outcome, but they have become burdened with a yoke they can no longer throw off. Ostensibly, he writes, the government was meant to be the servant of the people, but in reality, it, through the cartels, dominates and plunders the people. The cartels have become the masters. The commune offered a stark contrast, entailing a shattering of the former state power and its replacement by a new and truly democratic one. Or, as he puts it slightly earlier, the commune recognized that the working class could not go on managing the old state machine. To avoid defeat, it must do away with all the old repressive machinery used against itself and safeguard itself against its own deputies and officials. That the commune was defeated may in part be attributed to the fact that it did not have enough proletarian muscle, did not exercise the proletarian dictatorship as strongly as it should have done. The second question arising from this text concerns a linguistic struggle. What should the new structure that the commune began to institute be called? On the one hand, Engels is bound by his whole theory of the state as a separated public power. In this piece, he writes of the bourgeois state in the United States becoming a master and exploiter, an instrument of corrupt cartels. He also writes that the victorious proletariat will at some point be able to discard the entire rubbish of the state at some point. Footnote: the standard English translation has "throw the entire lumber of the state on the scrap heap." While this rendering captures the general sense, it misses the import of Staatsplunder, state rubbish, or junk. End of footnote. This moment may be delayed, awaiting an entire generation that had grown up in new and free social conditions, but come it must. On the other hand, he ventures into new territory with other observations. Most obviously, the new measures instituted by the Commune include elections to administrative, educational, and judicial posts. These are governing roles, as are the decrees issued by the Commune that began to reveal a new structure. At two other moments, Engels's sentences almost lead him to speak of a new type of state, but he stops short, knowing that such a statement would contradict his whole theory of the state. The first sentence has already been quoted. The former state power must be shattered and replaced or substituted by a new, truly democratic one. A new, truly democratic what? Engels does not and could not write "Staat" to complete his point, so what he means is left begging for now. See Chapter 4. The second sentence I have also discussed. It mentions that the working class, once in power, could not continue managing with the old state machine. Indeed, that has to do away with all the old repressive machinery. What replaces it? Engels does not write new state machine, for that would be going too far. Instead, he states that the Commune had to safeguard itself against its own deputies and officials through recall at any time and without exception. It is not a new state machinery, but it is a security mechanism to deal with those in administrative and organizational positions. On both occasions, the sentences seem to be leading to a new type of governance, if not mechanisms formerly managed by state structures. But Engels either leaves the term hanging or replaces it with another. By now it should be clear that Engels is struggling with the appropriate language. He occasionally risks falling into the language of state, but then catches himself. I have already suggested that Engels is beginning to indicate an enmeshed type of governance, one that is not separated from society, but in its midst. This position will become clearer later, but in this text we have a tension betrayed by the language. Unable to resolve the tension, Engels invokes the dictatorship of the proletariat as his solution. But it is not merely the proletarian dictatorship on its own, for he identifies it explicitly with the Commune. While this may at one level seem like a solution by fiat, with the bonus that it would rattle many of his readers, at another level it contains a deeper truth. Since the Commune had begun to destroy previous state forms, it really was an expression of the proletarian dictatorship. No romanticization of the Commune here, and a soft peddling on such a dictatorship. In short, Engels says, if you want the Commune, you must also have the dictatorship of the proletariat. Critique of the Erfurt Program, 1891. The introduction to Marx's The Civil War in France was written on 18 March 1891. 3 months later, between 18 and 27 June 1891, Engels composed another text that also connected the Commune with the proletarian dictatorship. In this case, it was a critical response to the draft party program that had been prepared for the upcoming Erfurt Congress. Footnote: correspondence also indicates Engels's focus on the Erfurt Congress. End of footnote. This would be a crucial event, since it would revise the initial unification program of the German party, achieved at the Gotha Congress on 1875. Engels was keen to ensure that the new program would reflect more clearly the positions of scientific socialism. More of that in a moment, for some background to these developments is already overdue. Engels's texts from the first years of the 1890s appeared at a time when the communist movement worldwide had made considerable progress. Political parties had established themselves and gained hundreds of thousands of members, especially in Germany. It was a situation that produced extensive debate over theory, policies, and programs. The catch was that they now were able to operate largely within the structures of the bourgeois state and its form of democracy. Pressure grew to soften communism's more radical edges, since some felt that these threatened the newfound legitimacy of the parties in question. The push for moderation was enhanced by the infamous anti-socialist laws instigated by Bismarck from 1878 to 1890. Even though support for the German Social Democratic Party grew during this period, questions arose. Should the party continue to advocate illegal means, such as revolution and proletarian dictatorship, or should it be content to work within the existing structures and pursue peaceful transition? As an old revolutionary hand, Engels could see the need to be sensitive to the mood of the times, adjusting strategy where necessary, and warning against untimely insurrection where it would simply reinforce suppression. But he also insisted on core revolutionary positions, especially when he saw them threatened. The dictatorship of the proletariat was one such position, which he felt called upon to defend and uphold, especially in the early 1890s. Even more, he was adamant that a gentle and idealistic image of the commune, harking back to the utopian communism against which he and Marx had struggled in earlier decades, was a distortion. In this context, the Erfurt Congress and its program would be crucial. As part of his preparation for the Congress, Engels had dusted off Marx's notes from the Gotha Congress. Footnote: in December of 1890, Engels wrote to Kautsky concerning the text, but urged the latter to tell no one else about it yet. End of footnote. Why had they not been published earlier? Karl Liebknecht, an editor of Vorwärts, was the main culprit. Although the text had been circulated in the 1870s in manuscript form, Liebknecht saw to it that the text, with its explicit invocation of the dictatorship of the proletariat, was not published and would certainly raise heaven and earth to block it once again. In light of this situation, Engels suggested to Kautsky that it might be published in Vienna or better in Neue Zeit, with less circulation but under Kautsky's editorship. Footnote: the party's right wing was not the only interested party, for Engels also had to account for censorship and the German police. He writes to Kautsky that any words omitted should be replaced by dots, while amended passages would require notes with explanations. End of footnote. The latter agreed, and Engels could not wait for its appearance, writing to Sorge that its publication would be a bombshell. Sorge may be delighted, but it would cause rage and indignation among a good many people in Germany. Efforts were indeed made to suppress the issue of Neue Zeit, with parliamentary Social Democrats actually trying to make use of the relics of the anti-socialist law. But when that effort failed, Marx's text was republished in Vorwärts itself. This did not stop what Engels called the Great Wrath in the party's Central Committee, as well as the parliamentary faction. Footnote: Draper gives a relatively detailed account of what he calls the rumpus in the Reichstag, where conservative politicians were keen to pin dictatorship on the socialists, while the right-wing parliamentary representatives of the party did their best to distance themselves from Marx's text. End of footnote. To the extent that they issued a statement that the text had appeared without their knowledge and boycotted Engels for some time. In late June of 1891, Engels followed up the publication of Marx's text with his critique of the draft program for Erfurt. Footnote: for the original text of the program, see MEGA I.32, Apparat, pages 691 to 694, and its English translation in MECW 27, pages 595 to 597. End of footnote. Some of the commentary focuses on specific wording, but the core, to which Engels devotes most of his energy, concerns political demands. He identifies two, one concerning the need for a unified state, which I leave aside here. Footnote: Engels strongly prefers a unified rather than federal republic, a concern from his youth. This intriguing discussion may be seen as a forerunner of the detailed debates leading up to and after the Russian Revolution, Would they pursue a cultural national approach, seeking to federate the many nationalities within the state, or would they seek a deeper unity through class that would then provide for and foster a whole new level of diversity? For a full analysis of these debates, see BOER 2017, end of footnote, and the tension between peaceful and revolutionary transition. While Engels understands the reasons, see above, why the opportunist tendency in the party favors the transition in a cozy, peaceful way, footnote, or as he puts it more strongly to Kautsky in a letter from 29 June 1891, the conciliatory opportunism of the forwards and the clean, joyous, devout, free ingrowing of the old filth into socialist society, translation modified. As Draper notes, Frisch from Frolichfrei was a slogan of the gymnastics movement established by Friedrich Ludwig John in 1811 with the explicit aim of creating a healthy and morally robust population, a liberal nationalist who desired a united Germany. John's approach was later appropriated by the Nazis. End of footnote. And while he entertains the possibility in places where people's representatives have all the power in their hands, France, United States, even the United Kingdom, he simply cannot see it happening in Germany, where the parliamentary system is a fig leaf for absolutism. Engels knows that any discussion of the deeply conservative German system is dangerous, yet this system has to be attacked. As he warms to the topic, the language becomes more militant. Developments will not lead so much to a peaceful transition, but to the need to burst the shell of the old social order like a crab violently breaks its shell. Even more, it will become necessary to break the fetters of the old semi-absolutist order. Not being aware of this need and not debating it at the Congress would leave the party ill-prepared at the crucial moment, even if all of these items could not, in the current climate, be included in the program. By now, Engels has prepared the ground for his identification of ticklish but very significant points. Quote, first, if one thing is certain, it is that our party and the working class can only come to power under the form of a democratic republic. This is even the specific form for the dictatorship of the proletariat, as the great French Revolution has already shown. End quote. Let us begin with the second sentence, where the dictatorship of the proletariat appears in conjunction with the Great French Revolution. Despite efforts to identify the revolution in question with that begun in 1789, the reference is to the revolution of 1871 and the Commune. On this question, the date of writing is important. As noted earlier, Engels wrote his critique in June of 1891, a little over 3 months after he had explicitly equated the Commune with the proletarian dictatorship in his introduction to Marx's The Civil War in France. Footnote. Other references indicate that both Engels and Marx referred to 1789, 1839, 1848, and 1871 as French revolutions. For example, the minutes of the General Council of the First International, 23rd January and 4th June 1872, use French Revolution to refer to the Paris Commune. In a letter of 1871 to Kugelmann, Marx speaks of the next attempt of the French Revolution. In a number of letters, Engels and Marx refer to 1848 to 1850 as the French Revolution. In 1851, Engels refers to the First French Revolution of 1789, and in the Mark, Engels speaks of the 1789, 1830, and 1848 revolutions. End of footnote. In this light, the form of a democratic republic makes sense. Engels does not mean a bourgeois democracy, but what would come to be called socialist democracy. Not a few interpreters have opted for the identification with the form of democracy under a capitalist state, an identification that may be supported by Engels's reference, few lines earlier, of the parliamentary systems of France, the United States, and the United Kingdom. In these contexts, he entertains the possibility that a workers' party may actually use bourgeois suffrage to attain some of its goals. But this is not the meaning here, for it runs against the tone of Engels's criticism of the draft Erfurt program. Instead, all turns on the dictatorship of the proletariat. Not only did this appear in the Commune of the Great French Revolution, but it also takes on the form of democratic republic. This is the form for a proletarian dictatorship. What does Engels mean by democracy? He provides a hint with the minimal suggestion that the program should at least include the phrase concentration of all political power in the hands of the people's representatives. Who are the people represented by this body? Footnote, Volksvertretung may also be rendered as representative body of the people. End of footnote. 3 months earlier, Engels had specified that the Commune's practice of universal suffrage was only for those concerned, and the exercise of recall was to be undertaken by these same concerned ones. As I pointed out earlier, those concerned are the workers of the Commune and not the former ruling classes or counter-revolutionary enemies of the Commune. The reference to democratic republic and people's representatives in the critique of the Erfurt program should be seen in this light. Footnote, thus it is not necessary to suggest that dictatorship of the proletariat refers to the class character of the workers' state, while democratic republic refers to its political form or clothing. End of footnote. Yes, Engels says, the Commune was a form of democracy, but not like any form that had been seen before. In the midst of the struggles of the early 1890s, Engels sought to rescue the Commune, the only example thus far of workers seizing power, from those who would see it as a modified form of bourgeois democracy. Instead, suggests Engels, the very definition of democracy must be rethought, a rethinking that would find its most succinct expression many years later in Mao Zedong's democratic dictatorship. As for the Erfurt program, it was substantially revised in light of Engels's criticisms and written up in its final form by Kautsky, who also provided a crucial explanatory text that came to guide the formation of subsequent communist parties. Introduction to Marx's The Class Struggles in France, 1895. Thus far, I have considered 3 texts where Engels argues that the Commune and proletarian dictatorship were one and the same, with the effect of rescuing the Commune from drifting out of context and becoming an idealized image of comradely cooperation. By pointing out that it was the first real exercise of the dictatorship of the proletariat, however short-lived and tentative it might have been, Engels made it clear that the Commune was a tough exercise, full of the harsh realities of the proletarian dictatorship. In short, the two could not be separated. To do so would risk relegating the dictatorship of the proletariat to the marginal status of an embarrassing problem. As we have seen, this theoretical development took place in the midst of struggle in which the moderating wing of the increasingly large social democratic German party sought to discard the proletarian dictatorship and advocate peaceful transition to socialism within the framework of bourgeois democracy. This struggle continued into the 1890s, as Engels edited and republished Marx's earlier works, in which the latter had begun to use the terminology of proletarian dictatorship. The next important moment in this struggle was over Engels's 1895 introduction to Marx's The Class Struggles in France, 1848 to 1850. While Engels did not use dictatorship of the proletariat in his introduction, Marx had deployed it for the first time in the text Engels was introducing. Some background. Marx's original text had been published as a series of articles in Neue Reichsche Zeitung over 1849 to 1850. By the 1890s, it was decided by the editorial board of the German Social Democratic Party to gather the articles and publish them together as a distinct book, so they approached Engels for advice and with a request to write an introduction. After some hesitation, Engels agreed, sending 3 articles that Marx had written and suggesting a 4th chapter that he had gathered from later material, with parts written by himself and parts by Marx, to be entitled The Abolition of Universal Suffrage in 1850. The title of the whole work, The Class Struggles in France, 1848 to 1850, was also proposed by Engels. Soon afterwards, he also sent the introduction to the editors. This introduction includes a long assessment of the situation in the 1890s with regard to military action by insurgents, street fighting, and barricades. With his long-standing military knowledge, Engels assesses the changing circumstances in terms of tactics, weaponry, and perceptions of the public in response to revolutionaries. He also notes the rise of communist parties as electoral forces, urging caution and careful assessment of the new context before engaging in such actions. The risk of failure is even greater, and the possibility of moral victory attained in earlier efforts has largely vanished. Yet he firmly holds to the need for revolutionary action in the future, which would have to be carefully considered and revised. Fewer skirmishes before a major revolution are more likely, but revolution is still required. The fate of the introduction is telling. Footnote. For a useful overview of the events, see Moser, 1990. End of footnote. Upon receiving the text for publication, the executive of the Social Democratic Party became anxious yet again. As with earlier occasions, see above, they were torn between immense respect for Engels's authority and their delicate political position in Germany. Not only were the anti-socialist laws still fresh in memory and experience, but the Reichstag was also debating in the early months of 1895 yet another law aimed at preventing a coup d'etat. Thus, the editors were working at a feverish pace to complete all of the planned publications in case the law came into effect. But they were also keen not to aggravate the situation. Would Engels please tone down the excessive revolutionary tenor of the piece so as to not incite the authorities? He was sent a copy-edited text in which all references to future revolutionary militancy were altered or excised. At times it was a phrase, at times a sentence, and at times a whole paragraph. In his reply to Richard Fisher in March of the same year, Engels was clearly unhappy with the efforts to subscribe to absolute legality under any circumstances. Nothing can be gained, he writes, by advocating complete abstention from force. No person, no party would forfeit the right to resist by force of arms. Yet he writes that he understands the party's position in Germany and so relented on some editorial changes, but resisted 5 others that would have changed the meaning entirely. A couple of weeks later, he wrote to Kautsky that his text had suffered to some extent from the apprehensive objections inspired by the subversion bill of our friends in Berlin. But he also acknowledged that in light of the circumstances he could not but take account of these objections. From the side of the editors, perhaps Bebel's letter to Engels a few days later captures the tensions best. We do not ask you to say something that you do not wish to say or may not say, but we ask you not to say something which, if said at this time, would be embarrassing for us. Footnote. Translation mine. End of footnote. The story has further twists. Under Liebknecht's guidance, yet again, the editors disregarded Engels's reservations and pressed ahead with all of the changes they had made. They published selections from the introduction in the leading article of Vorwärts number 76 on 30th March 1895 under the title Wie man hut Revolutionen macht. The authorship was attributed to Engels. Upon receipt of the issue of Vorwärts, Engels was incensed. The next day he wrote to Kautsky, I was amazed to see today in the Vorwärts an excerpt from my introduction that had been printed without my prior knowledge and tricked out in such a way as to present me as a peace-loving proponent of legality quanand meme. He requested that the complete original text should be published in Neozeit so that this disgraceful impression may be erased. And he promised to give Liebknecht and others involved a piece of his mind for disfiguring and perverting his views. Neither would eventuate. As for the letter to Liebknecht, perhaps it was the advancing throat cancer from a life of enjoying tobacco and alcohol that prevented him from castigating those involved. Perhaps the letter has been lost. As for the anticipated rectification in Neozeit, the journal published the introduction in the heavily edited form in numbers 27 and 28, and the book Die Klassenkampf in Frankreich, 1848 bis 1850, appeared in the same year with the introduction in the form that the editors deemed fit. What are we to make of this important moment? As mentioned earlier, Marx had deployed dictatorship of the working class and then class dictatorship of the proletariat for the first time in the material that was now being published in book form. Although Engels did not use either term in his introduction, he was by now well known as an advocate of such a dictatorship, which he saw as coterminous with the Paris Commune. Clearly, many in the German party were uncomfortable with the idea and its militancy, so we may resort to a betrayal narrative in which the revisionists, taking advantage of Engels's failing health, betrayed the need for revolution for the sake of parliamentary reform. Footnote: but who are the revisionists? Is Liebknecht one of them? Engels obviously thought so in 1895, with his efforts to water down the militant emphasis upon which he and Marx had always insisted. Yet, Liebknecht would become part of the Spartacus League, being a leader of the Spartacist uprising in 1919, in which he and Rosa Luxemburg were murdered. How about Kautsky? Lenin later identified Kautsky as a renegade due to his advocacy of the ballot box and decrying of the Russian Revolution. Was it Bernstein, with his advocacy of peaceful transition once the bourgeoisie saw the benefits of socialism? Now, Kautsky becomes a radical, for he opposed Bernstein as the chief theoretician of the second generation. End of footnote. Or, we may follow the line that Engels had realized the need for peaceful parliamentary means within the structures of the bourgeois state. By contrast, Engels may be the best guide here as reflected in his observations to Paul Lafarge a couple of days after he became aware of what had happened. He accuses Liebknecht of playing a fine trick on him by taking from his introduction everything that could serve his purpose in support of peaceful and anti-violent tactics at any price, especially in light of the threat of new laws against the Socialists. At this point, we can easily suggest that Engels had been betrayed, but then he writes, "I preach those tactics only for the Germany of today, and even then with many reservations." Despite his best instincts, Engels realizes the need for such an approach in a particular situation. In certain circumstances, it is necessary to adapt for a time in order to advance the cause. Some may call this opportunism, but if so, it is a productive opportunism, a needed zigzag, so that the project may continue. Liebknecht, Engels feels, lacks this sense, seeing only black and white. Quote, "Shades don't exist for him," end quote. In other words, communism requires not one or the other, not revolution or reform, but appropriate tactics for specific circumstances. Engels' legacy would come to fruition with subsequent communist leaders such as Lenin, Mao, Deng, and indeed Xi Jinping. Letter to Comrade Schmidt, 1890. Gewalt is also an economic potens. The final text concerning the dictatorship of the proletariat appeared a little earlier in a letter to Conrad Schmidt in 1890. However, I deal with it at this point since it provides a transition to the next section on socialist Gewalt. The letter is one of a number that offer a more complex dialectical approach to the metaphors of base and superstructure, especially in response to those who would read the metaphor in a mechanical and even reductionist fashion, so that the economic base is active and the superstructural domains passive. Footnote: the four key letters are those to Joseph Bloch, Comrade Schmidt, Franz Mehring, and Walther Borgias. End of footnote. We do not need to go into the details here, save to point out that Engels is keen to stress the relative autonomy of the various realms, political, legal, philosophical, religious, artistic, and so on, in relation to economic factors. They act upon one another in a reciprocal fashion in which the economic is determinative only in the last instance. In the letter to Schmidt, Engels deals mostly with elements within the economic realm, particularly production, trade in commodities, and trade in money financialization, in order to point out that they develop their own dynamic whilst interacting upon one another. A similar, philosophical point applies to philosophy, religion, and the state. Here, he emphasizes that although the state arises from the division of labor within society, it acquires a relative independence that enables it to react in turn upon the conditions and the course of production. The two may be unequal forces, with the economic trend predominating, but the state is able to act in the current circumstances in three ways. It may work with the economic opposite, or it may block some lines of economic development and stipulate others. Why opt for this emphasis here? In the previous chapter, we saw that Engels prevaricates on whether the state is relatively autonomous, is an instrument, or is imbued with the nature of the class exercising power. In that analysis, I focused on the instrument-nature tension, passing briefly over the question of relative autonomy. But here, Engels presses the point that the state strives for the greatest possible independence, assuming a trend of its own. Again, why? Engels has in his sights not merely the current context of Bismarck's transformation of Germany into the major European power. Bismarck had dramatically resigned only months earlier, on March 18, 1890, where it was clear that the state had acted somewhat independently, but also on what might happen after a communist revolution and the exercise of socialism in power. Thus, after pointing to some of Marx's works where Marx emphasized the crucial role of politics in the 18th Brumaire and in regard to the working day and the history of the bourgeoisie and capital, Engels observes, quote, "Otherwise, why should we be fighting for the political dictatorship of the proletariat if political power is economically powerless? Gewalt, i.e. state's power, is also an economic force," end quote. Macht, Gewalt, and Potens. The semantic fields of the three terms obviously overlap, but let us take one at a time. Macht, with its sense of might, power, and authority, is in fact Engels' preferred usage earlier in the same text. He speaks of die politische Macht and Staatsmacht when emphasizing the relative independence of the state in relation to economic matters. But in the sentence quoted, he invokes Gewalt, the dominant usage in most of his texts, concerning the state. In this case, it appears as a solitary usage, and one may see it as simply another term for Staatsmacht. The parenthetical "that is" may reinforce such an impression. However, Gewalt has a sharper edge than Macht, invoking the sense of violent force. So why deploy it here? It follows upon the invocation of dictatorship of the proletariat, which now has the specific qualifier political, die politische Diktator des Proletariats. I propose that Engels is seeking to sharpen the sense of Macht, to ensure that he means not merely governmental power with all its assumed parliamentary legitimacy within the framework of bourgeois democracy. And what does the proletarian dictatorship, the Gewalt, or indeed Staatsgewalt, exercised after a communist revolution do? It works directly to change the very forces of production as a political actor. Footnote: Draper's observation that the use of dictatorship of the proletariat in this letter is tossed in and with extreme casualness as a mere symptom for the conquest of political power misses the point completely. End of footnote. Otherwise, why would the communists bother if such a power was economically powerless? Now, Engels deploys his third term, ökonomische Potenz. Gewalt, he writes, has economic potency. The semantic field of potens includes sexual potency, creative power, and economic and political potency. Engels' point in this sentence is that far from being economically powerless, the dictatorship of the proletariat, as Gewalt in its own right, is economically virile, creative, and potent. To sum up, for Engels, the dictatorship of the proletariat is an inescapable dimension of socialism in power and should never be abandoned. Already in the 1890s, he faced efforts in the wider communist movement to water it down or dispense with it altogether. Right-wing moderates, anxious not to incite the authorities of the bourgeois state, found the proletarian dictatorship distinctly embarrassing, if not alarming. Far better than to focus on Marx's glowing depiction of the Paris Commune from which the proletarian dictatorship could be excised. Here, we find a tendency that would appear later in Euro-communism, as well as a number of thinkers who were more than keen to drop the proletarian dictatorship entirely, or at least soften it in light of a certain perception of the commune. Not so, is Engels's reply. In fact, the commune cannot be separated from the dictatorship of the proletariat, for they are one and the same. In its very being, the commune, albeit for too short a time, was the dictatorship in action, or, as the letter to Comrade Schmidt puts it, the dictatorship of the proletariat is both political power and economic potency. In short, it is socialist Gewalt. Socialist Gewalt. Quote, "It is recognized that force, Gewalt, also operates with revolutionary effect." Engels, 1876 to 1877. By way of conclusion, let me focus on Engels's explicit use of Gewalt to speak not only of the dictatorship of the proletariat, but also the communist project as such. He does so in two overlapping ways, in terms of seeking power through revolutionary action and in the actual exercise of power. Thus, we find that already in the early 1870s he began speaking of a real, powerful proletariat, or indeed of the right of the working class to use violent force in order to realize its demands. On this matter, he echoes Marx's observation in the same period, quote, "One day the worker will have to seize political power to establish the new organization of labor," end quote. Unlike the early Christians who disdained politics and failed to realize their kingdom on earth, quote, "It is violent force which must be the lever of our revolution. It is violent force which will have to be resorted to for a time in order to establish the rule of the workers," end quote. More concretely, what does this mean? In his notes to Anti-Düring, Engels counters Düring's aversion to struggle and arms, emphasizing that a revolutionary party must also know how to struggle, for it will have to make the revolution. To ensure that the party is prepared, Engels observes that universal conscription is actually an advantage. It should be taken advantage of by all to learn how to fight, but particularly by those whose education entitles them to acquire the training of an officer in 1 year's voluntary service. As he sums up in perhaps the earliest version of what would become a communist catechism and then the Communist Manifesto, communist aims could be achieved by no other method than a democratic, violent revolution. More extensive are Engels's comments on the exercise of power after a revolution. Let us begin with the notes Engels wrote in German and French. For his speech at the International's London Conference in 1871, in reply to the anarchist push for the working class to abstain from political action, Engels writes, quote, "We want the Abschaffung, abolition, of classes. Sole means is political Gewalt, domination in the hands of the proletariat," end quote. Not long afterwards, and in the preface to the 1872 reprint of the Communist Manifesto, both Engels and Marx reflect on the implications of the Paris Commune. The proletariat for the first time held political power for 2 months, revealing that the working class cannot simply lay hold of the ready-made state machinery and wield it for its own purposes. Footnote. Note also the observation already in 1850, in light of the 1848 revolutions in Europe, that the proletariat must seize Staatsgewalt in order to dispossess the bourgeoisie and gain control of the means of production. End of footnote. Almost 15 years later, Engels would repeat the same point in French. Quote, "For the first time in its history, the working class seized political power. Pouvoir politique." End quote. Footnote. On this occasion, the German translation of the French offers politische Macht. The same expression in translation would also appear in the English edition of 1888. End of footnote. While it may be possible to read this usage of Gewalt in terms of power rather than the stronger reaches of the term's semantic field, a text from the same period clearly stresses the harder edge of the term. In response to the emerging anarchist position which advocated the abolition of all authority, from workers' participation in politics to the authoritarian state, Engels writes, "A revolution is certainly the most authoritarian thing." Footnote. The German translation of the original Italian article has das autoritarste Ding. For the build-up to this piece on authority, see a series of items from Engels from 1851, 1871, 1872. End of footnote. It entails imposing the will of one part of the population on the other by means of weapons and in order to ensure the success of the revolution, it must maintain this rule by means of the terror which its arms inspire in the reactionaries. Footnote. For terror, the German translation has Schrecken, with the sense of fright, horror, and terror. End of footnote. At this point, he invokes the Paris Commune, not only speaking of the authority of the armed people, but also reproaching it for not having used it freely enough. Footnote. The German translation offers dieser Autorität des bewaffneten Volks. End of footnote. It is in this sense that we should read the observation in Socialism, Utopian, and Scientific, originally in Anti-Düring. After observing the internal dynamic of the contradictions of the capitalist mode of production, Engels writes, "The proletariat seizes political power and turns the means of production into state property." Footnote. Compare Engels in 1878 to Engels in 1894. End of footnote. The initial French of this text, La Force Publique, is rendered in the German edition of 1891 as Staatsgewalt, or, as he puts it even more clearly in material added to Socialism, Utopian, and Scientific, quote, "Proletarian revolution, solution of the contradictions. The proletariat seizes the public power, and by means of this power, transforms the socialized means of production, slipping from the hands of the bourgeoisie into public property." End quote. Engels's position on socialist Gewalt should by now be clear, as also its inescapable connection with the proletarian dictatorship and thereby the commune. But it is also connected with the gradual dissolution and ultimate disappearance of the state. Since this is the subject of the next chapter, where I deal with the careful choice of language, the state's dissolution and disappearance is one of the final results of a proletarian revolution. In response to the anarchists, I leave the analysis of such matters until later. Here, it is important to note the language used to speak of the state. It is, writes Engels in 1883, an organization that has been focused on securing by armed force, by an armed, repressive state force, the domination of the wealthy minority over the working majority. So much we have already seen. But what is the working class to do when it has power? It will need to possess the organized political force of the state so as to trample down capitalist class resistance, the counter-revolution, and organize society anew. Footnote. Trample down and organize society anew are my translations. End of footnote. This is not simply part of a wish list, for the working class must do so as its first task. Footnote. Once again, Engels mentions that he and Marx had already elaborated such a position in the Communist Manifesto, an assertion he also made in the housing question. See the earlier treatment of this assertion. End of footnote. On this matter, Engels is one with Marx, who writes in his notes on Bakunin that while the capitalist and other classes still exist, the proletariat must use violent means. In other words, as long as the conditions that produce class struggle continue to exist, they must be cleared from the road or transformed by violent force, even to the point where the process of transformation must be accelerated by violent force. Footnote. Translation mine. End of footnote. One final point, which concerns the dialectic between objective and subjective factors. In Anti-Düring, Engels initially stresses the objective contradictions of the capitalist mode of production, which leads inexorably towards a communist revolution. At a crucial point, he identifies the subjective dimension using the analogy between social and natural forces. He describes the latter as working blindly, violently, destructively, but only as long as we do not understand them. But when we do, we are able to subject them more and more to our own will, so that we can attain our own ends. So also with social and economic forces. Once we grasp them, they can be transformed from demonic masters into willing servants. Obviously, this subjective dimension applies to socialism in power, which seeks to transform or convert not only economic structures, but also political power. Conclusion. We have arrived at a point that may be uncomfortable for some. Engels, and indeed Marx, was clearly a proponent of the necessary role of violent force, Gewalt, in both socialism seeking revolutionary power and in the early exercise of power after such a revolution, not merely to transform the socioeconomic conditions, but also to deal with the counter-revolution. He increasingly emphasized the indispensable role of the dictatorship of the proletariat in the exercise of power, to the point of connecting it directly with the Paris Commune against those who would separate the two, stressing the calm and peaceful transition via bourgeois democracy into an idealized commune, or even the passage from the proletarian dictatorship to the commune. Engels stressed ever more strongly that the commune was the proletarian dictatorship. Further, Engels was also, like Marx, very clear that socialist governance involves Gewalt. This emphasis by Engels, particularly in the 1890s, raises a distinct question in relation to the narrative of stages we find elsewhere. According to this narrative, the proletarian dictatorship was to be the initial step towards, and indeed a means of, achieving the commune. Thus, the proletariat would need to exercise violent force to deal with the counter-revolution and decisively shift the forces and relations of production. But once this was achieved over a shorter or longer period, the proletarian dictatorship would give way to a structure somewhat like the commune. Footnote: Ehrenberg, 1992, in particular, emphasizes this narrative with good textual justification. End of footnote. The narrative was tentatively explored by Marx, and we will see it come to the fore again in dealing with the enmeshed apparatus, Chapter 5. But the question is how such a narrative of stages relates to Engels's firm position that the Paris Commune was at one and the same time the dictatorship of the proletariat. There are a couple of viable answers. The first is that the connection between the commune and the proletarian dictatorship was a tactical move by Engels in a particular context, but that overall he held to a theory of stages. The second is that Engels did not see the Paris Commune as an expression of developed or mature communism. It may have offered a glimpse or two, but no more. His introduction to Marx's The Civil War in France indicates that the second answer is better. While he reiterates the core findings of Marx, he does not engage in the enthusiastic praise for the commune that we find in Marx, especially in the earlier drafts of the text. Instead, Engels emphasizes the early and tentative nature of the commune's actions, its inability to go further due to the armed forces bearing down upon it, and the mistakes made, the most notable being that it did not use enough force. Thus, the commune is in fact part of the early stage of the proletarian dictatorship, providing only a glimpse of what might come. At this point, the topic of the next chapter begins to emerge, which concerns the difficult and often misunderstood concept of the failing or dying away of the state. Beyond that lies the anticipation of enmeshed governance and the dialectical transformation of baseline communism. Indeed, a hint of what is to come has already appeared with my earlier quotation from Socialism, Utopian and Scientific. It also speaks of a pouvoir public, an öffentliche Gewalt, a public power that the proletariat seizes. The initial temptation is to identify this public Gewalt immediately with the state as a separated public Gewalt, particularly in light of earlier material. But this move is too hasty, for Engels and Marx also speak of a public Gewalt that is not so separated, and that remains in the hands of workers and indeed peasant farmers. But this is to leap ahead beyond the state's dying away. To that topic, I now turn. End of chapter 3.